Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Mary Grace Gardner, founder of the Young Professionista College Admissions and Career Services, and I have a special guest joining us today. Now, before I talk about our guest, Caroline, I wanted to share with you why I invited her over here. So, as we are transitioning over and emerging from the pandemic, our high school students are undergoing a whole lot of transition, right? They have been living life for the past year and a half, almost two, in a very abnormal situation. And as they're transitioning back, making sure that they're set up for success is super important. And understanding how they can stay organized and on top of the new demands of their schedule is going to be really important to their future success. And so that's why I invited our guest today, Caroline Sumners. She is the founder of Empowerment Academic Coaching, a company dedicated to helping middle, high school, and college students achieve their academic goals on their own terms. Before starting her company, she taught middle school science and English and high school biology for 7 years. She studied biology at the University of Georgia and has a Master of Arts in Teaching Biology from Agnes Scott College. Welcome, Caroline. So happy to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
So let's first start off, Caroline, with what are you noticing with the students that you're working with as they're transitioning over to in-person learning? Not everybody I know in the United States has 100% transitioned over, but most have. What are you noticing during this transition?
Yeah, one thing I am noticing is that students are struggling with getting back into the routine of 8 hours of school, perhaps having athletics that have resumed and clubs and other activities, and their schedules are just so packed compared to what they were for a lot of students last year, where many of the students that I work with were able to do their schoolwork from home. A lot of their sports teams were not meeting in person. There weren't many other school activities. And that has just been a really tough transition. Even if students were used to that schedule before COVID, it's just been a really tough adjustment. And so, one thing that I think is really important for students to know is that you're not alone. There are lots of students who are feeling this way, and there are ways to help make it feel like a little bit of a smoother transition. But at the same time, it's also okay for it to just be kind of weird right now and to ask for help from people who can support you.
It's an interesting phenomenon, I think, where students and families assume that because 2 years ago, the student was able to handle all that, right? They were able to go to class, the commute to and from school, have all those extracurriculars, and it was fine, right? And a lot of students actually wanted things to be quote unquote back to normal, where they had the in person learning and they had that scheduling. And what I'm also noticing with just amongst my students that I'm mentoring is I have two different, very different types of students. One are the ones who are thriving in this environment, loving coming back, feeling like things are super easy because distance learning was pretty tough on them. And then I have the other folks on the other side of that range who are overwhelmed, feeling like things are so busy. And especially for my seniors who are in the middle of college applications, they are just feeling like their heads are spinning with everything going on. And so I think what's super important right now is really getting organized, right? And figuring out how do they prioritize. And I know that's something that you really specialize on with your students. So what is the first step there? So let's go ahead and kind of focus on the students who might be feeling really overwhelmed right now by the demands of school, by just having to sleep kind of normal schedules, not taking naps in the middle of the day. What are some things that they should do the first step to getting on top of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the best place to start is to define what organized means to that student. So, a lot of times as students are in the early grades in school and maybe even through high school as well, teachers will often define what looks organized. They might require a certain kind of binder organized in a certain way, or the school might purchase specific agendas that students are expected to use, but there may not always be the teaching behind why that strategy works. At least that was my experience when I was a teacher. Our days were so full of the other things that we needed to get to that those executive functioning type skills, things like organizing and planning and prioritizing, often took a backseat to the content. However, that's a problem because it's really hard to do your best on learning the content if you don't have a great organization system in place. And organization is such a personal thing, and it really depends on what that student considers organized, and maybe even that could be difficult to define for the student. So they can also think about what problems are they facing in their life right now. So for example, some of my students think organization means having a clean backpack where they know where everything is, or having a binder where if their teacher asks them to pull out a certain worksheet or set of notes, they're able to easily find that. But for students who aren't sure what organization would look like for them, I would encourage them to think about what's a problem they faced recently because they weren't organized. So did they forget to bring back a assigned syllabus for one of their classes? Or did they forget to click turn in on an assignment? One of the problems some of my students have been facing is as they return to school, teachers are returning to kind of their own individualized ways of doing things. When schools were more online, often they would all align on, we're using Google Classroom to push out our assignments or whatever platform. And so if they're getting back to this, things are kind of all in different places, it can be hard to always remember, oh, I have to click submit on Google Classroom for this one. I have to bring this one in on paper. So if that's the problem, then that requires a much different solution than forgetting a paper at home. So that's where we always start with students. What does organization look like for you? And what are the problems you're facing because you feel like you're not organized?
I think that's really important. I'm so glad that you mentioned it. It's not one size fits all for whatever technique, or even like you're mentioning the definition of what organized means, because there's people who can thrive on having things on a bunch of post-it notes. Some who, if for students who have phones, would do well with using phones, or paper products. I remember when I was in school, elementary school, I loved paper planners. In college, everyone knew I would be the one running around with a Franklin Covey little paper planner. Even in work, I do that, but I also have my digital calendar as well, right? So I like to plan in both ways. But it was something I started really young, right? And was able to have fun with it because I would use little stickers or color coding or whatever it was that made it fun for me. What I have found also quite interesting when I'm meeting with students is when I ask them how do they stay organized, well, probably the majority, maybe 90%, say that they stay organized by having it all in their head, right? So I ask them, how do you know what homework is due? How do you know how to plan? And they say, oh, I kind of just like remember it and then figure it out in my head, right? And I think while that might work, I think the nature of just as school progresses, things get harder. There's more things to remember. There's more deadlines. Putting things all in your head is not always the best way, right? And I tell my students, you might want to free up that brain space by giving yourself an easy organization system so that you can use that brain space for something else rather than having to constantly remember, oh, that assignment's due on Friday. Oh, wait, that assignment's due on Friday, right? And having it actually live somewhere else. So what might be a first step for a student to kind of figure out what might be the best modality for them to be able to be organized? If it's a paper product, if it's an electronic product, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I like to encourage my students to kind of think with a scientist mindset of let's try out some different things, tweak one variable here and there and see what works. Because if you haven't ever used a digital calendar, with consistency, then you're not going to really be able to say if that works for you or not. So I like to start conversations with students, asking them what they have tried before and what they gained out of that experience. One thing I notice is if students have tried something before and it didn't work, there can often be a lot of shame associated with that. And maybe it makes them feel like it's not even worth trying again. But there's a lot of great information in our failures and in things that didn't work for us. So if they've tried a paper agenda before and it didn't work out, we talk about what are the things that kept that from working out. It might be that they, just don't enjoy writing things down. They have their phone and would rather type it in. Or it could be that they just kept forgetting it and they really would like to write things down, but just never had it when they needed it. Both of those things will point in different paths for different solutions. So I always encourage students to start there and to really not give up when things go wrong, because they will. I mean, do you ever find that in your organizational system, you maybe forget to like put something in one of your planners?
And I think that's natural, right? You think, oh, I'm going to go and write that thing down, or I'm going to go and do something. And then you get distracted by something else, right? And so someone calls your name and they have a question, you get a phone call, you get a text right in the middle of you wanting to write down or remind yourself of that item. And then you might remember that thing a day or two later, right? So there's, I think, constant distractions. And that's why I really love your perspective of figuring out what works for you. So, like for me, what I've learned is I'm going to ask Siri on my phone, remind me of whatever, right? The moment it comes, I'm going to ask, I have it as a male voice. I ask him to tell me to go ahead and remind me of whatever it is, right? And so I think being able then to figure out what are some ways in which you can adjust your system to be able to catch some of those misses, and also knowing that it's a live system, right? Like you just need to continue to figure out what works for you, and what might have worked for you as a freshman might be very different than what works for you as a senior. And I am hearing you on making sure that you kind of approach it in that scientific way.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Our organizational systems change depending on the season of life we're in, or even just the particular project that, I have some uh, students that I'm working with who have a certain system for their kind of everyday school homework to-do list, but they have a different system when they have a really big, weeks or months long project, because they just find that different systems work better for that. And I would really encourage students to be flexible, like you mentioned. And we you mentioned that there are sometimes things that you forget, and you've developed a system to help with that. Same for me as well. I have multiple systems that I use, and they don't always work perfectly. And so I just try to approach it with, how am I going to, try to solve this? And it's really important to me that students know perfection is not the standard here. It's really just about making an improvement on things that you're finding are contributing to stress or to feeling disorganized, or like you're not able to do your best work.
And sometimes it can be intimidating for students because it seems like a lot of work to try to get organized or to put the system in place. But I actually think the stress that gets induced by sometimes feeling a little frazzled or missing those deadlines or missing an assignment, some of that upfront work to kind of put your system together. And it could be simple, right? It could be super simple. I have students who might have a whiteboard in their home, and they just kind of jot down what are the things they need to do. It can be super simple, but just that little bit of planning can make such a big difference for students. One thing I've noticed too is when I've talked with students who are just learning kind of how to do this, first off, oftentimes families and parents think it's an assumption that students know how to do these sorts of things. And I actually approach it with not assuming the student knows very much about it, right? Because and then they can tell me how much they actually know. Well, one thing I've been surprised by when I was first working with students is that sometimes they may, and this is also adults, may underestimate how much time it takes to get anything done, right? And so they might say 30 minutes for math, 30 minutes for science, 30 minutes for chemistry, and then I'll be done in time, right? Versus really thinking about, well, how long does it take me to write an essay? How long does it really take me to finish my math homework? And then blocking out time as accordingly. I remember I had a student who was feeling so stressed, so tired, felt like she was always behind. And I had asked her, have you ever mapped out, like literally wrote down how much time it takes you to do what? And then she did. And then she realized that when she factored everything in, her day was 26 hours long, right? And I asked her, how is that physically possible in a 24-hour day? And she realized that she wasn't planning, she was overestimating how much she could do in the amount of time she allotted herself. Are you noticing things like that in your work as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I love that you worked with that student on actually looking at how much time something takes. I work with a lot of neurodivergent students, and of course, this can happen with any student, but particularly this is helpful for neurodivergent students. For example, students who may have ADHD. We all perceive time a little differently, and that includes on, on a calendar. So for some students, just looking at a box on a calendar is not going to be that helpful, because it is hard to really, write down what you're going to do and visualize how much time that's going to take. So for some students, I recommend that they get one of those planners that divides the day up by hour and actually color in every hour that's currently accounted for by school or by sleep or meals, other non-negotiables in their day, and then look at really what's left and do that work of apportioning out what's going to happen on which day and what's realistic.
It's super important, I think, especially as parents. And I have little ones. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. And I know that oftentimes we have to remind our children to do things, right? Oh, don't forget this assignment. Oh, don't forget you have class after this. Don't forget you've got, right? And so we might get used to having those reminders. And what I've noticed too for high schoolers is oftentimes parents are still doing that, right? Is reminding them of these different things, which is great and helpful. And it's helpful to also be mindful of when they're in college, they might not have that parent nearby to remind them of all the different things, or they might not even be aware of all the school assignments, right? And things that are happening. So developing these skills early on and really strengthening them over time, I think really helps students with being ready to be even more successful as they progress in their education. So Caroline, can you tell us a little bit more? Why did you decide to go into this line of work? You were an educator beforehand and now you opened up your own business. Can you share a little bit more about why you decided to specialize in this sort of work?
Yeah, so it was really a confluence of different factors, but one of the most important to me is I hinted a little bit earlier about how there wasn't enough time in the school day to help students with these tasks. And as a consequence of that, I started to meet with a few of my students who I noticed were really struggling with planning their week um, at 8 o'clock before the school day began. And it was just a small group of students. We would sit and they would just brainstorm what are all the things that they had going on that week as part of their seventh grade workload. So they would share all the different tests that they had coming up or different homework assignments. We would write those on the whiteboard and then we would start splitting them up into the different days of the week. And it was such a simple process. Earlier you talked about how these systems can be really simple. This was really just, a printout of paper that had 5 different days on it for the week. And they would write what they had going on based on what we put up together on the whiteboard. But it was such a great way to start the week. And I really saw the difference it made just to have that consistent space where we were able to plan. And I saw how much I just really enjoyed working with a smaller group of students, helping them make progress on these things that, you're right, aren't always taught to younger students and to high schoolers. So I really enjoyed that. Um, and it also helped me develop the idea for my coaching services. I meet with students on about either once a week or twice a week basis. And we meet at the same time, same day, every week for the most part. And that really replicates what I found in working with my small group at the middle school, is just that having a consistent time where you actually do the organizing work is so powerful. I think sometimes students want to be organized, but don't really think about how much time it takes to get organized. Even if it's just setting aside 15 minutes on, Monday after school to look ahead at your week and start planning things out, having that consistent time to do that is so key.
What's something you think parents can be doing now with how everything is going, and as students are transitioning into in-person learning, things might be feeling really chaotic for them. What's a tip you have for parents to support their children as they are kind of relearning or readjusting to having these sorts of skills?
Yeah, that's a great question because I work with so many parents who feel the exact same way. They see their kids hurting and struggling with this just chaotic time and want to be a support system for them. My recommendation there is to ask questions and to show them ways that you cope with the same sorts of problems. And that's way different from telling your child to work in a certain way. So, for example, I have some parents who have an organization system that works really well for them and they want it to work well for their child. And I totally get that because they're an expert in that type of organization and they see how beneficial it could be. But especially for teenagers, it's just where they are in their life. It's very natural for them to want to be independent and want to figure out their own strategies. So I think a way to kind of strike that balance is to maybe show them how you use your digital calendar and kind of just invite them to look at how you set it up and ask them, do you think this is something that would be helpful for you? Or what are your ideas about how you'd like to be organized? What would you like to try? And how could I support you in that? And I think giving students that space for them to say what they would like to try and how they want to be supported can lead to conversations that feel really just productive and affirming for families.
I love that you're turning it into more of an asking for them to inform the solution versus telling them. I think that's just human nature in general, right? Even as adults, we probably don't like to be told what to do. We like to be asked for our opinion, especially if we are expert in how we think and how we feel, right? And it just shifts that dynamic. Even in my practice in working with families and students, sometimes parents get so frustrated that they keep telling their student to do something, and then when I ask the student about that particular problem or issue, ask them what do they think is the best way to approach it, they might come away with the exact same solution that the parent said. And the parent will turn to me and say, how did you get them to do it? And it's more so that I just asked them. And so they take ownership over whatever it is they put out there. And giving them just that level of control can make such a big difference. It's such a small nuance of telling versus asking, but it can make such a big difference in helping a student develop independence.
I totally agree. And one thing that I found that's helpful too with that is to encourage parents to focus on the outcome rather than the process of how that outcome is achieved. So, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, if a parent is noticing that their child is struggling with remembering to, put their homework in their backpack to go to school, um, rather than stating a plan that you want to put in place for that to happen, you can talk with your child about what could we do to achieve you having your assignments in your backpack ready to go to school. What are some ideas that you have? And I agree with you. I've been in the same situation so many times where even sometimes I'll have an idea and I know as a coach, I cannot tell my students advice or what I think is best. It's really about uncovering what they think. But sometimes it's so tough if you are an expert and you really do know that your idea could be helpful to them. But it's so worth it to just hold back and let the student say how they want to achieve it, because then they get to be the one that is proud of solving their problem.
Yeah, there's numerous studies out there that demonstrate that the ability to be able to create those habits and those changes, having the recipient, the person being coached, being able to have some control over what that looks like and to generate ideas has a much higher success rate of imprinting than being just told what to do. So I'm so glad to hear that that's something that has worked well for your students as well. So Caroline, is there anything else that you're wanting families or students who are listening to this to know?
I would say it's important to expect a bit of an ebb and flow in your life with implementing these strategies. So, get comfortable with trying different things out. One thing that a lot of our students are enjoying working with this year is digital post-it notes. So things like Google Keep, in combination with reminders. So, if there is something that we've mentioned here that you haven't tried and you're curious about it, I would just encourage you to try it and um, know that there will be little bumps along the way and that is all part of the process. That just helps prepare you so much more for what's coming next for you in college and career and beyond, to just have that ability to be flexible and able to problem solve and try new things.
I love that. I literally have digital post-it notes on my screen as well. And you're so right about trying different things. I've tried having different digital backgrounds that will help me with organizing different things. I've tried different planners, different pieces of paper, even the size of the physical post-its that I'm working on, trying different ones or even different colors, color coding. All of those different little tweaks can just help with making things more organized. So, Caroline, if there are families who want to learn more about you and your services, where should they go?
Yeah, I would love for families to check out our website. It's Empower, EMPOWER, academiccoaching.com. And we also have our Instagram, which is at Empower Academic. And I would love for families to check out the Empowered Learner Planner we have on our website, because that is a planner that students can use either digitally or on paper, that guides them through a lot of the process that we've just described, including, figuring out how much time it takes to do each task and then using that to plan out their week. And one other thing that I would love to let families know about is that for the month of November, we are sharing some question prompts on our Instagram to help families have deeper conversations with their children. So, for anyone who has felt like when they ask, "How was your day at school?" if you feel like you're not really getting rich answers from that, our prompts are designed to help families have deeper conversations.
Thanks so much for sharing that. So we'll also make sure to have those links in the description below so that families can check those out. So Caroline, thank you so much for joining. This was such a helpful conversation. And for those of you who are watching the audience, let us know what is either a question that you've got for Caroline related to organization. We'll make sure to go ahead and answer those. We'll come back into the comment section and answer them. Or if you've got organization nailed down in your family, feel free to share those tips and tricks in the comments below, because I'm sure other families would very much appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.